In 1967, three Harvard scientists published a study in a major nutrition journal. The study concluded that dietary fat was the primary driver of heart disease and that sugar was largely irrelevant. That paper influenced public health guidelines, school lunch programs, and the food industry for the next 50 years. What we now know from documents uncovered in 2016 is that the Sugar Research Foundation paid those scientists the equivalent of roughly $50,000 in today's money to reach that conclusion. The data wasn't fabricated, it was selected, and what got left out quietly shaped the modern obesity epidemic. But that cover-up is actually the least surprising chapter in the history of sugar. The chapters before it are worse. This is Object Origins, where we trace the real histories of the things we take for granted. I'm glad you're here. We're going to go from a riverbank in New Guinea 8,000 years ago, through the Atlantic slave trade, through Napoleon's continental blockade, and land somewhere uncomfortable, your kitchen. By the end of this, you'll understand why sugar isn't just an ingredient. It might be the single resource that has caused more human suffering than any other substance on Earth, and why that suffering didn't stop when slavery ended. It just changed form. Worth saying up front, nothing in this video constitutes medical or dietary advice. The health data referenced here comes from published research, and I'll flag where the evidence is strong versus contested. Sugarcane was first domesticated in the highlands of New Guinea somewhere around 8,000 years ago. For most of early human history, it was chewed raw, a local crop traded between islands, sweet but unremarkable in the global picture. Then Arab traders moved it westward. By the time of the early medieval period, sugar cultivation had spread across Persia, North Africa, and into the Mediterranean. Arabic agronomists developed refinement techniques, boiling, crystallizing, that turned raw cane juice into something closer to what we'd recognize today. They called it cond. That word becomes candy. When Crusaders reached the Levant in the 11th and 12th centuries, they encountered refined sugar for what was, for most Europeans, the first time. They called it sweet salt. They brought it back to Europe as a luxury, and the demand it created would eventually reshape 3 continents. For roughly 400 years, sugar in Europe was priced like silver. Serious historians document it appearing in wills alongside jewelry and land. It was used as medicine, as a spice, as a status display. Kings had sugar sculptures made for banquet tables. The fact that it rotted teeth was, ironically, a kind of fashion. Black teeth signaled you could afford enough sugar to damage them. That demand needed supply, and supply needed land and labor at a scale that Europe couldn't produce. The Portuguese began planting sugarcane in Madeira and the Canary Islands in the 15th century. When they reached Brazil, the scale expanded. When the Spanish, British, French, and Dutch moved into the Caribbean, something happened that has no clean parallel in economic history. An entire system of forced labor was built, sustained, and legally protected for over 300 years, specifically to grow one crop. This is the history of sugar and slavery told plainly. An estimated 12 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic between roughly 1500 and 1900. A significant portion of those voyages existed to feed Caribbean sugar plantations. The mortality rate during the crossing, what historians call the Middle Passage, ranged from 10 to 20%, depending on the voyage and era. Those who survived arrived at plantations where the average life expectancy, according to historians who've studied plantation records from Jamaica, Barbados, and Saint Domingue, was roughly 7 years. 7 years. That figure matters. It wasn't that enslaved people were worked until old age. They were worked until death, and replaced. The economics were calculated. Purchase cost weighed against productive years. Sugar plantation owners in the 18th century did not try to extend the lives of their workforce. They optimized for extraction. The triangle trade that sustained this system is worth understanding structurally. European manufactured goods traveled to West Africa, where they were exchanged for enslaved people. Those people were transported to the Caribbean. The sugar, rum, and molasses they produced traveled back to Europe. The rum then moved to Africa to purchase more enslaved people. Each leg of the triangle was profitable. The system reinforced itself. I know the counter-argument here, that many societies practiced slavery, that this wasn't uniquely European. That's true historically. What was distinctive about Caribbean sugar slavery wasn't the institution of slavery itself. It was the industrial scale, the biological disposability of the workforce, and the fact that the entire global sugar economy depended on it for centuries. In 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte imposed the Continental System, a blockade designed to cut Britain off from European trade. It had an unintended consequence. It also cut continental Europe off from Caribbean sugar imports. Napoleon funded the development of sugar beet processing, a technology that had existed in rudimentary form but had never been economically competitive with cane sugar. By the early 19th century, France was producing sugar from beets grown in European soil. After the blockade ended, the technology didn't disappear. It got cheaper, then industrial. By the late 19th century, refined sugar was no longer a luxury. It was cheap enough for the working class. Consumption across Europe and North America climbed steadily, then steeply. The supply chain that had required 12 million enslaved people to construct had, through industrialization, become self-sustaining, and it kept accelerating. What nobody tracked carefully at the time was what that accelerating consumption was doing to human health. The research would eventually arrive, but by then, there were powerful interests in ensuring it arrived slowly. Back to 1967, the Sugar Research Foundation's funding of that Harvard study wasn't an isolated incident. Documents reviewed by researchers and published in peer-reviewed journals in the 2000s suggest a pattern across several decades. Industry-funded studies that consistently minimized sugar's role in metabolic disease while amplifying concerns about dietary fat. The fat phobia that dominated nutrition advice from roughly the 1970s through the early 2000s tracks closely with this period of industry influence. Here's what the evidence now more firmly supports. Sugar, particularly fructose in large quantities, behaves differently in the body than most other caloric sources. It's metabolized primarily in the liver. In excess, research suggests it can contribute to insulin resistance, which is a core mechanism behind type 2 diabetes. That disease currently affects somewhere around 500 million people globally. The scale of that number is genuinely difficult to hold in mind. The addiction research is worth handling carefully because the word addiction carries clinical weight. What laboratory studies have found, and here I'm referencing research involving rats given intermittent access to sugar solutions, is that under certain conditions, animals display preference for sugar over cocaine at rates approaching 90%. Whether that maps directly to human neurochemistry is debated. What isn't really debated is that sugar activates the brain's reward system in ways that promote repeated consumption. The food industry, it's worth noting, has spent considerable resources understanding exactly how that mechanism works and how to use it. Sugar currently appears in an estimated 80% of packaged food products sold in the United States. It does so under more than 60 different names on ingredient labels: fructose, dextrose, maltodextrin, cane juice, corn syrup solids. Some of those names are not intuitively recognizable as sugar. That may not be accidental. In 1967, scientists were paid to look at the evidence and point somewhere else. The people who profited from sugar had already spent 3 centuries pointing somewhere else, at trade routes, at economic necessity, at the logic of empire, while 12 million people were transported across an ocean to tend a crop that would outlast the system that grew it. The sugar trade history runs from a New Guinea riverbank to a Harvard research office, and the thread connecting those 2 points is always the same: immense profit, obscured cost. Slavery ended, legally, painfully, incompletely. But the appetite that slavery built into the global food system didn't end with it. It industrialized. That's the thing about sugar that sits with me. It's the only resource I can identify that enslaved people twice. Once physically, across 3 centuries and an ocean, and once chemically, through a food supply that was quietly engineered around the same reward mechanism. Worth keeping in mind as you read an ingredient label. A quick note to close. If you're looking at your own diet or health situation, please talk to an actual doctor or registered dietitian. Nothing here is personal medical advice. If this one gave you something to think about, a like genuinely helps this reach more people who'd find it useful. And if you're not subscribed to Object Origins yet, there's more on the channel that goes this deep into the real histories of things we think we already understand.